right, well, if people please take our seats, we're going to start our session on security of crowdsourcing. And we intentionally used the title security of crowdsourcing rather than cybersecurity, because this goes beyond cybersecurity. We also need to think about our duty of care. So I'm going to hand this over to the esteemed Eric Rasmussen, who will introduce the panel.
The esteemed Eric Rasmussen, not that guy from yesterday. He's all better now. Good morning, all. We spent some time, so several of you have heard of Camp Roberts and the area near Paso Robles, California, where we get together for a week and do some experimentation in the field. While we were at Camp Roberts this year, we sat around in a living room in a rented house late at night over wine and talked about this panel. That's where much of the best work is done. We recognized about then that the original term we had considered for this, cybersecurity, was far too narrow, and that most of the work that is put at risk, which is the overall theme here, is put at risk by people, not by technology. So we changed it to security, and we talked a little bit about what that actually meant in the modern world. We managed to pull together three truly superb people for this. George Chamales, B.K. Long, and Riley Eller all have deep experience in how security as a meme, really, is managed in the modern world, and they do it for large companies, they do it for small people, they do it in the open source world, they do it in the very, very corporate world. And what I'd like George to do first is a little scene setting, because most of us in this room really don't know the depth of the problem or the complexities of the interim solution, since we're nowhere near a solution now. George, would you start for a few minutes?
Sure. Thanks, Eric. So one of the questions that we get asked all the time goes something like this. It's, so you do computer security. Does that mean that you can hack into my computer? And the answer is yes. That's exactly what that means. Hacking into computers is actually loads of fun, and it's getting easier and easier every day. You see, over the last 10 years, there's been a concerted effort by the international security community to build open, freely available catalogs of vulnerabilities and exploits that can be used to break into computers for every type of imaginable software out there, and it's being updated almost daily. And those libraries, those catalogs, are being used in open source tools, again, freely available to anyone, that make hacking into computers, in a lot of cases, as easy as point, click, hack. Now, if open source isn't your bag, there's a whole variety of corporate organizations who'd be more than happy to send you or to sell you corporate security products that do the exact same thing. They're going to charge you tens of thousands of dollars for their exploit frameworks, but they can also give you technology that'll let you do massive surveillance, that'll let you strip encryption off of network communications. And these are being sold to anybody who has the cash. And at the same time, this is driving an international market for new tools and new exploits that no one knows about, that can be used to hack into millions of computers. And those are being sold both in above ground and underground markets for thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars a piece. Now, so yes, we can hack into computers. But as Eric was saying, computers aren't the only things that we hack into. People are fantastic weak links in security. And I guarantee that when you guys get home, if you have an email saying, hey, it was fantastic seeing you at the Wilson Center at the Grassroots Government Conference, here are the slides for the presentations, there's a large number of people that were going to click on that link and get compromised because they didn't notice that the email wasn't from the organizers. And similarly, if we were to take thumb drives, little thumb drives that a lot of us carry around, and sprinkle those in an office parking lot, I guarantee there's going to be a large number of people who are going to come across those. Go, well, that's interesting. They're going to walk right in the door, right through security, right past all the network protections, plug that thumb drive into their computer, and open the first interesting file they see. And they're going to get compromised. And we know this. These things are being done actively day in and day out. And once you're able to compromise a person, once you're able to get onto their computer, then you have access to all the computers that are nearby. Then you have access to their usernames and passwords. Now, I'm sure everyone in here uses different usernames and passwords for all the different sites that you use, but most people don't. So once you get access to the people, you then have a huge variety of options for where you're going to go from there. But breaking into computers and breaking into people and hacking people are really just a means to an end. What we're really shooting for when we're doing security and when people are attacking systems is we want to have operational impact. We want to do something. We want to steal money. We want to get access to sensitive information. We want to do things to an organization. The people and the computers are a means to that end. And we've seen growing sets of operational impacts. One example is in Syria recently. Over the last couple of months, there have been targeted attacks against activists using custom-made malware believed to be created by the Syrian government. And it's being spread using a combination of technology and people. One of the ways they've seen this being moved about is someone will go onto a Skype chat, log in, using the credentials of someone who is expected to be there. Now, how did those credentials get compromised? Maybe they got hacked. Maybe the person was picked up, tortured, and those credentials taken. But they'll get into the Skype chat and say, hey, everybody, here's the latest document that you need to read to give you an update on what's going on. They'll get the document, they'll click on it, they'll open it, they'll get compromised, and the cycle will repeat, mapping out networks of activists and groups of people that are working on the ground. In Iraq, there was a new set of Apache helicopters arrived at an operating base. Shortly thereafter, there was a targeted mortar attack, came in, blew up 4 of the Apaches. That's multiple millions and millions of dollars, huge operational impact. And how did that happen? The best guess from the Army in their press release says that they believe that when the helicopters showed up, one of the first things the soldiers on the ground did is they went out and they took pictures with them. Now, we've talked a lot about how great it is that pictures nowadays come with geotags built into them. But the same people that have been taking those pictures are then putting them online. The bad guys know this. They find a picture that says, hey, here's us in front of these new Apaches in Iraq. They go through, they pull out the geotags from the images, they target their mortars 10 feet in front of where the camera was. There's the opportunity for huge operational impact. Now, and when you think about that, our job from the security standpoint is to work at each one of those levels. We have to think at the technology level, we have to think at the people level, and we have to think at the operational level. And to do that, we have to start by being as devious as the bad guys. I call it getting in touch with your inner devious bastard. You have to be able to think about what is it that these bad guys are going to come up with? What are they after? How are they going to go after it? And then once you get to that point, you have to be even more devious because you have to figure out how to outsmart them, how to put the security measures in place at each one of those levels that can prevent these attacks from taking place. And that requires a huge amount of knowledge, a great deal of technical expertise. We have to understand software. We have to understand operating systems. We have to understand networking protocols, encryption. We have to understand routing protocols. We have to understand how all of these things interact, web applications, databases. There's a huge variety of things, and it's being updated all the time as people come out with new exploits, new ways of surveillance, new ways to detect people that are working on networks. And we have to take all of that, and we have to integrate it. And we have to integrate it not just at the technology level, but at the people and at the operation. And what you see when you think about security from that perspective is you realize that security is not a product. You are not going to solve these problems by buying antivirus, by having a firewall. Security is not a product, it is a process. And integrated properly, crafted properly, and put into place in each of these levels, we have the opportunity of protecting organizations and being prepared to respond to attacks. Now, the question that we have today is, how do you take these principles and how do you apply them to crowdsourcing? And it's a really tough question. We're talking about new technologies, we're talking about crowds full of people, and we're talking about the opportunity for major operational impact. So it's going to be hard. But when we're talking about using these things in crisis and disaster situations, everything is hard. Why would this be any different? Is there going to be dangers? Absolutely there's going to be dangers. Doing anything in dangerous situations is dangerous, and this should not be any different. The question is, can we deal with it? Can we come up with something that allows us to do that hard work, to mitigate those dangers so that we can move forward? I believe the answer is absolutely we can. And on behalf of myself and my fellow panelists, I'd like to thank the Wilson Center and Leah, John, Eric for the opportunity to continue this process. Thanks a lot.
So, I'm not going to go into any details on the biography of these 3 people, but I will tell you that we chose them because they are world-class, proven really, really good at what they're talking about. Okay? Sometimes on the challenging side, if you're a corporation, sometimes on the DoD all the way inside to the E-ring version if you're a corporation or a federal agency. So speaking of people who are really good on both sides, Riley, would you mind talking to what George has just brought up and some of your own opinions?
Yeah, first, George, really, really well said. Set the stage excellently for the scope of the problem. See, security is, the word security, I think, is often mistaken for the word invulnerability. And so the first thing to get in our minds when we talk about security is that a well-advised person who feels secure, security is the opposite of anxiety. If you feel secure, then you're probably really not, and probably in a lot of trouble. It's being lulled into a false sense of security. It's a sense, it's an emotion, it's a feeling, it's a way we teach and interact with each other. And so, if you don't see enough anxiety around a problem that you think is probably worrisome, you need to find someone to pick up responsibility for securing that, or reducing the vulnerability level, reducing the exposure level. And also, I think people think of security experts like they think of their computer experts, like they're programmers. And that's, I think there's a lot of overlap in the past between those people, but I think you should really probably see us as computer lawyers. We go in and adjudicate lawsuits between exploits and operating systems and decide which one's bad and fix and change the rules. And to that end, I think that you should also be setting your eyes on having an internal resource or an external retainer relationship with a person like one of the three of us, so that they care about you when they're not in your office. See, if you ask me to tell you what's wrong with you today, I can spend a lot of time analyzing what was wrong with you the day you asked the question. But you're changing, you're reacting, new situations are coming up, the rules change, the laws change, the clients change, the situation changes. And once I'm finished with my report, I go away and go on to the next client as a consultant. And you essentially have a document that you're not going to read, not going to implement, and was irrelevant about the day I started writing it. If you instead say, Riley, will you come here every couple of months and work with our technologists, work with our policy people, work with our governance people, work with our oversight people, and help them think through their processes, then I can make them smarter slowly, because my knowledge and my help is not a product, and neither is BK's and neither is George's. Our knowledge is helping processes. So if you're going to think about security in any way, if you're going to approach these problems in any way, the most important thing is to make a continuous, stable, and durable process review. That's the only thing that we know how to do really in the long run to get to the goal you're looking for. I have some ideas for later. I think Eric and I are going to work out maybe next year's version of this panel tonight. But in short, Stuxnet is a really great example. Stuxnet was purportedly a US/Israel developed penetration tool to take out certain microcontrollers that were used in centrifugal devices for separating uranium. That Stuxnet program is exactly the kind of commercial software that he was talking about. You can go and just pay someone and get a tool to go do international damage, I don't know, good or bad, warfare, combative behavior. I presented that software model in 2002 in Singapore, and we now, 10 years later, finally see the first examples that you all know about. So whatever the advanced state of the art is that you're becoming aware of, that's 10 years old, and what we're really doing on the underside is so frightening that sometimes it sounds kind of cartoonish, and I'll finish with one more setting the stage of things that you wouldn't really expect. To win a contest once, we got an American citizen, Korean ethnicity woman who knew a lot more about technology than most people anywhere, and we got her to sit small inside of a server box. And we packaged it up with IBM brand box and wrapping, and we put it in a FedEx container, and we rolled it in ourselves. We never shipped her. We rolled it ourselves wearing FedEx costumes up to a knock and said, hey, we're here to deliver your new server for your geospatial tagging information. Where should we install it? and they opened the doors, and they set aside the metal detector, and they put aside all of the checklists and everything else, and rolled us right into the Network Operations Center, right up next to the databases. We did this at about 4:45 in the evening, so that 15 minutes later, when all the administrators picked up and walked out and locked the doors, she had something like 11 hours and 45 minutes to open up every single machine and remove the hard drives. We stole the entire data set of an entire agency. It took her about 75 minutes to complete. She walked out wearing the FedEx uniform that we left inside the box, saying, "Okay, I'm finished installing that device. Can you let me out?" to the security guard with his back to the door on the outside. So sometimes it's the really devious bastard move that you have to be thinking about how amazingly dependent we've become on machines, and try to remember not to adopt new dependencies unless you really have to. I'm sure I'm over my time, so thank you.
Oh, no, you're not over your time. That was fine. Stuxnet. Many of us in the room heard a little bit about it, and that was what's known as a directed attack. And I don't pretend to know anything at all about this except what The Economist has told me. And before we go to BK, let's talk about directed attacks for just a moment. These guys can correct the numbers, but Stuxnet was, as Riley mentioned, the first of a directed attack model. Subsequent to that, we found something
first publicly known.
Say again? As far as we know. Sorry, yes, always as far as you know. Flame is a subsequent problem, much larger, much more flexible, modular, can recruit parts of itself to be built as it discovers what's in its environment. And with Stuxnet the first, as of the 10th of December last year, there were something like, of this class of directed attack, 325 directed attacks being discovered per day. Per day. So on that cheerful note, let's go to BK. You wanted some specific thoughts? Please.
I do. Hi, my name is BK DeLong, and I'm a technologist who focuses on risk management as well as information security. And one of the things I've noticed with my experience also as a disaster services volunteer and being here and hearing a lot about the challenges of being on the ground as well as being a researcher is there are kind of three things that I think need to be kind of considered in addition to allow for I think for crowdsourcing volunteers and crowdsourcing information to be more trustable. And that's application fostering, relationship management of people, and metrics programs for process improvement. And for application fostering, in private industry, if application development is outsourced, more often than not, you have regulations that dictate standards. And with those standards, or with this outsourcing, you have third-party vendor risk at that point. You have to do some sort of assessment to see the potential vulnerability, make sure it meets the regulatory standards, and if not, the vendor needs to fix it and bring it up to spec. For crowdsourcing of the third-party applications, which is happening with companies like Topcoder, I'm pretty sure that's the same, although there's no mandated, standards around that yet. I'm guessing that that's something that may need to be considered with governments taking on crowdsourcing applications. However, as my co-panelist pointed out yesterday, you can't have applications that are not hosted, open source applications or crowdsourced applications that aren't hosted or that are hosted by an amorphous entity. They're going to disappear. They're going to, after a while, people lose interest, and they're going to go into the ether. So you need to have a relationship with an entity or some sort of hosting provider that is going to keep it for the long term. Set up an MOU with Google or Amazon and find a place to put these crowdsourced applications, and in the long term, set up fostering relationships. So take into consideration these application fostering idea. for the long term. So the crowdsourced applications don't disappear, and look into making them secure. Look into the fact that there are companies out there that do secure them. Second, relationship management. How do you develop trust with the onrust of virtual volunteers that want to come out during a disaster and show up and help? You basically can do automatic scoring services like Clout and look at creating programs that validate Twitter users, but that's kind of challenging. However, many NGOs exist to help agencies vet volunteers. The Red Cross exists. They have to put people through background checks before they become volunteers. I had to do a Corey in Massachusetts before I could become a volunteer. So I suggest two things I've actually written down around it. If people volunteer for the Red Cross and Salvation Army, but they can't do on-the-ground work when they're called, why not have the volunteer coordinators send them to VOST or any of the other crowdsourcing organizations that are springing up? And I'm not talking about just kind of, have them listed, actually set up relationships, because the government has MOUs with the American Red Cross. Start saying, okay, let's start looking at crowdsourcing organizations or virtual organizations as an option to reach out to. And then second, how do you train these volunteers in crowdsourcing? You have Intro to Shelter Ops. You have Intro to Mass Care that the American Red Cross does. Red Cross is starting to do online training as well of some of their most common courses. Why not start to, we know the basic training that you started to need for crowdsourcing skills. Intro to GIS, intro to crowdsource volunteering. Why not start taking people who are doing crowdsourcing, bring them to the Red Cross, and start introducing these courses into the Red Cross training system, whether it be online or for in-person courses. Then you start having training volunteers, both of the Red Cross and in general, in crowdsourcing. And you have a function to do that. And third, the metrics programs for process improvement. We brought this up yesterday. I don't know that we know. It's difficult to do on the ground, collect metrics. We don't know what the metrics are. My point is that, as both a futurist and an archivist, process is important. And there's no way you can do process improvement if you don't collect what factors went into making the decisions in the moment on the ground. And that includes the human factors. You have humans making decisions, including emotional ones, when they're in high pressure situations. And you need to have the ability to collect, in the debriefing situations, in the debriefing after the fact, why somebody made a particular decision. And if a process is having continued success or continued failures, there's a reason for that. What's working, what's not. But you can't tell that unless you have the ability to collect all the information possible, either before, during, and after an incident and an event. And my advice is, let's start looking at the ability, looking at, in information security, we have security information and event management tools to do that, to collect all of this information, to reduce risk, and to improve security processes. So that's why I brought up securitymetrics.org. We don't want to just collect, okay, we stopped 30 people from getting through the firewall. We stopped, 40 people using this vulnerability. No, we want to improve security processes and reduce risk, and that's why I brought that up. So.
Excellent, DK. Excellent. Thank you. Before we go out to the crowd to talk a little bit about the questions you may have, we have a question from Canada. Our colleague Doug Hanchard wrote in asking, and let's go to George first, about accountability. Many of us have worked in software development. A number of us work in crowdsourced tools that wind up in crowdsourced circumstances. And can you talk a little bit about accountability in the development of tools that will be used in crowdsourcing?
Sure. So there's been a lot of talk over the last day and a half about open source versus not open source technology. And when you get right down to it, open source, really all that means is what license is it being released under. And so a license doesn't confer any kind of magical properties to software whatsoever. What's really important is the organization that is responsible for developing and putting out the software. And you kind of divide them up into about 3 different categories. There's commercial organizations that are making their living selling software. Then you have an open source developed software that is more of a community effort. And that's kind of the vast majority of open source, large scale open source projects are things that are either developed by a user community or a user community that is then supported by a company. And what's interesting as I started working in this space is there's now this strange third category, which is software developing organizations and companies that are backed by donors. And the strange thing when you start getting into the motivations from a security perspective from each of these organizations that they can be wildly different. So we don't assume that because when we're doing penetration testing, when we're being hired to break into companies and systems, when we come up against a commercial tool, we don't immediately assume that they're doing anything right. Because the fact is that company is not selling its software based on how secure it is. It's selling it based on a million other features about how flashy, how pretty, how fast, how many features it has. And security is way, way, way down the list. So the motivation in commercial organizations to develop secure code is relatively low. In community-based open source software, you start to get potentially better. Because you do have people who will actually care and can dig in, and there's potentially more eyes on it. It's by no means a guarantee at all that open source software is going to be more secure or less secure. And I would argue that even the potential for security weaknesses increases the smaller and smaller and smaller the organizations developing the software is. The fewer people that are really working on it, who have the time to focus on things like security, you have a lower opportunity of getting that for smaller organizations. And then finally, with donor-backed software, I'm really concerned that in those types of situations, that software is being developed to help people in the field, and I'm sure you guys get this all the time with donor-backed operations, but at the end of the day, they're beholden to their donors. Those are the actual customers. And so if those donors aren't making security a top priority, then it's not going to get done. And as a result, you have the opportunity for getting potentially even worse security from donor-backed organizations. And what we found in crowdsourcing, there's a variety of different organizations that are involved. You can be using things like data.gov, which is a commercial-backed product, which you can then decide, is this something we really want to trust? You can use third-party companies, people like Crowdflower, Mechanical Turk, which may or may not have their own security metrics and processes in place, or you can use open source software where you're in the exact same position. So there is no blanket statement that can be made about commercial software versus open source software versus donor-funded software. It really does the best chance you have of really understanding whether or not something is secure is work with security people. The analogy I use is I'm really, really good with computers, but when my car breaks down, I go to a mechanic. And if I try to figure out what's wrong with my car, I'm just going to be wrong. And by the time I get to my mechanic, I'm going to look like an idiot. But if you actually work with people who are experts in this, they can do the evaluation. They can go back to the companies. They can go back to the organizations. They can review the bug history of these software systems to get a sense of where the mistakes are being made, what's the frequency of the mistakes. And they can start to give you a sense of, yeah, we feel good about this, yeah, we don't feel good about this, and do these things, and we might be able to mitigate that risk.
That's a good start. Jen, you had your hand up first.
Sorry, just a second.
Oh,
I want to add on to what George just said and point out one really common theme that you should hear, but I want to make it crystal. Relationship management is the solution and the nature and the process for almost every piece of everything we've talked about for the last 2 days. It's relationship management with the volunteers, relationship management with the people that are being served, relationship management with the funders, with the regulatory committees, with the lawyers that help you do that review, with the security people, with the people building the software, with the people entering your data. And so that relationship management, if it starts after the crisis has begun, it's way too late. Relationship management needs to be 80+% stable before the crisis arrives. So you need to have crowdsourcing be a part of the daily operation of your organizations. It needs to be a piece of how you do work every day so that it's not something you turn on one day. Nothing that is used in an emergency only is ever used in an emergency. If it's not used daily, it does not get used. That relationship with technology is just another kind of relationship that you need to have your mind on and think about how you're going to mature it. Thank you.
Good point. Thank you. And although, as Leah pointed out yesterday, all of the panels that we've talked about here in the Wilson Center over the last couple of days have been exceptionally good. We went to the people who had been burned really badly to select these 3 people to be on this panel. Okay? So just a heads up. Value is proven here. Jen?
I just want to echo, this has really been a fantastic panel and I've learned a lot. But help me feel a little less hopeless than I feel right now, right? Because then I know, for example, my email account is always open in multiple locations and I can shut it down and et cetera. I have personal security issues, but I don't have what I feel is the bandwidth, the funding. Where a lot of us are overwhelmed by work. And so my inclination is to almost give up and just say, look, my Gmail is basically an open account. It's like writing on a wall. There's nothing really interesting in here anyway. I hope people are enjoying reading boring stuff. But the point is, I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but how do you feel? Like you were talking all about how there's so many things and you have to be ahead of the game and we're 10 years behind and I'm not an expert in these things and we're all busy. So how do we see, like, am I the only one feeling this way, or is there like going to be an overall trend where everybody's just going to say, look, there's no such thing as being secure or private anymore in this world?
So it's a really great point, and there is a lot to be dealt with, and everyone everywhere in the world is in the same position. And the vast majority of computer security is really designed for being good enough for most people. And where that starts to break down is when you're working in environments where there are really, really bad guys who are specifically targeting you, where good enough for most people is not good enough for you. And fortunately, there's been a growth over the last several years of activist-centric security groups, and there's a variety of them out there, and they really are putting together the information that can be used by people who are operating in the field, operating in hostile environments, that they try to distill down and say, okay, you don't have the time to learn all this stuff, but here's our guide to doing this. And there's a growing number of those. What we haven't seen on the flip side for crowdsourcing is anything specific to crowdsourcing, but there are people who are security people who are focused on the challenges facing activists that do include things like email. How do I communicate over the internet securely? And I think about it as there's 3 types of people. There's the people who don't care and will never be convinced that they care. There's people like you who want to care, but don't know where to go. And then there's people who have the time and the effort to really go through and dig it out. And these organizations, I think, are doing a really good job at getting those second 2 groups of people, the people who want to know, and giving it to you in a way that you can use.
And to follow George's metaphor from earlier, if you take the car to the mechanic regularly, it doesn't blow up. And that's following on with the idea of a retained relationship with your mechanic. Get somebody you trust and have them come to your office or your home or wherever the buying agency is once a quarter and spend 2 days with you. The first year, it'll feel like a little bit of a spend of 8 days. The second year, you'll start feeling a lot more secure. And in 3 or 4 years, you and everyone that you're working with will start to understand, like, okay, let's not adopt that yet. We're not ready. You'll develop an internal sense. But it doesn't take more than 20 or 30 days spread out over a couple of years with any one of the 3 of us or anyone like us to just become part of your life and to start caring about your problems, because our advice just doesn't apply until it becomes our problem too. And once that relationship is strong, you'll get exactly the comfort and the security you're looking for.
BK, any thought?
No, the biggest problem is, there are individual security things. There's things like 2-factor authentication for your Gmail, and I'm going to just defer to Riley and what George said. It's really going to your mechanic regularly, and it's not hopeless. It really isn't.
Yeah, because remember, the bad guys are less good at this than you are. Really, they're way more worried about much smaller issues. And so if we didn't really talk about this, but there's a second scale. I mentioned the timeline of before the incident and after the incident, and you have to work before the incident to be ready at the incident. We all know that, but relationship management fits in that model. Well, there's a second scale, and that's the hostility. In a non-hostile environment, nothing we say matters. I mean, your security will come down to the reliability of your software. Sometimes it'll break, and it'll be accidental, and it's not a big deal. Just, have you tried rebooting? Have you tried unplugging it?
Is the cord plugged in?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But as the scenario gets more and more hostile, it's relevant to understand that the Federal Information Protection Service and many other federal processes for information assurance exist. They're valid. They're not that hard to work through, and you can pay a consultant to spend about 2 years with your plan and make your plan every day a little better and a little better until you can qualify for TRL 8 in information assurance, technical readiness level 8, meaning it's really ready for use in a hostile environment. And all the kinds of vulnerabilities that we know how to do, we can also protect you against if you're willing to go to the, I'm doing this for wartime. If you're not going to a wartime scenario, you don't need IA that much. So there's that scale of relevance based on the hostility of the environment. And if you're in a really hostile environment, we have really good techniques and tools, but they're really expensive. So if you're not, don't bother. Just go to the mechanic.
So IA, information assurance. John?
This tags on to that. John Crowley, I am wondering about the interface between the grassroots and government. As government employees begin to catalyze crowdsourcing behavior, either in imagery or maps or in citizen
John,
reporting.
is that mic on? Can you guys
Is it
hear?
on? Is the mic on?
Okay, good.
Okay, good.
Sorry.
As federal employees begin to catalyze these efforts, as we saw with USAID, as we've seen with the State Department with OpenStreetMap, what principles, what security principles do they need to now incorporate into those agreements before they catalyze them? And in particular, I'd love to follow up on Riley's comment on information assurance. What we've seen so far in some of the work that we've seen is a tendency to want to get to risk elimination, however quixotic that may be, as opposed to risk management. What are the principles that keep us within a reasonable realm where we can get stuff done but be relatively protected?
I want to go to the last part first. There's this idea of risk management, risk mitigation, and risk elimination. There are kinds of risk elimination that are possible. Intelligence communities in particular use the Bell LaPadula and BIBA models for confidentiality assurance and for integrity assurance of orders. You can't use both of those systems in the same world at the same time. It's physically impossible to make a perfectly secure confidential system that allows for orders. Otherwise, how would you know who your orders came from if it's perfectly confidential? So there are perfect solutions, there really are, to slices, to little pieces of the problem, and you do not want them. So risk elimination is the kind of thing I'm talking about when I say wartime information assurance. We can really do some amazing things. A really great commercial example is Amazon's card payment system. I will literally eat my own underwear in front of this panel if anyone ever steals a credit card from Amazon. Literally. That will never happen. I know that. I know also that I have stolen a credit card from everybody who has ever paid me to try, except Amazon. There is a system you can build. They hired former Langley people to come in and build their payment system. So you can pay enough to get certain levels of perfect security, but it's not worth it to anything you guys are doing because you're not trying to make a bunch of people give you their credit cards. So you need to do risk management and risk mitigation. BK was right. On the low end, it's risk management. What are we exposing? Who are we exposing it to? How are we making their lives better? How are we endangering them? And then risk mitigation, how can we change our policies over time to improve that?
I'm
And
going to, I'm sorry, BK?
I was going to say, in the business world, you're constantly hearing risk management because they don't want security to interfere with business. So you're going to run into situations where if you're working with things, Google and things like that, they're not going to want to go so far as to interrupt the flow, and there's mitigations there. So and when you're working with grassroots organizations, same sort of thing. They're not going to want to go so far as to cut off, and there's going to have to be a happy medium, I think, where government may want to be certain organizations may want to be FIPS compliant, but the grassroots organizations, they're not going to be able to afford to or can't meet FIPS compliance in order. So there's going to have to be the happy medium, which is why I'm suggesting. I suggested the kind of MOUs that are had with like the Red Cross and things like that, and finding those happy mediums there.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Okay. We're going to follow up. We will
I have
follow up.
only a small question, so if you want to continue the
No,
discussion.
Alicia, go ahead. We're going to come back.
It's a small question. So I've heard you talk about hostile environments yesterday and today. So what do you mean by that? Hostile-ready environments?
Sure. So if I am delivering religious services, then hostile environments include any location where the local religion is violently opposed to what I'm doing. I can be delivering political insight into countries that are politically violently opposed to what I'm trying to say. Hostility is a nature of the resistance to the service you're trying to provide. So if a place has people who are trying to push some group of people off of land and you're trying to make equality happen or trying to resist that, your resistance can create hostility. I mean, literally just basic human hostility.
Okay, so this, I think I just would like to make the point that I think it's a wonderful that for some of our discussions and some of the problems that we're trying to solve, we glom and group together all ideas of big societal crises. And in other cases, I think it complicates problems that don't always need to be complicated. I think, for some situations, you might have to think about the hostility factor because it's just gigantically high. And for others, it's just not there, or not there during the short time frame where you're doing a certain kind of response. And so, especially when it goes to investments of technology development, and liability to volunteers and formal workers and all of these kinds of things, it is worth, I think, discriminating by the with respect to these different kinds of crises that we're talking about.
If you don't, the security problem will literally overwhelm your budget, your time, and every good intention you have to deliver a service.
Yeah, so not every natural hazard is automatically crazy hostile.
Not at all.
Which is what I loved hearing about the DHS guy, David Kaufman, was speaking about their different orientation to natural hazards was in response to this presumption that it's hostile. We act as though it's hostile going in, right? So we have to make that distinction.
I think that's a really good point, and I think it also ties back into John's follow-on question was about the processes. The fact is, this is not a one-size-fits-all process either. And it is really important that it be tailored to the specific situation. So when you say what can be done to enable crowdsourcing between grassroots and government, that's a very difficult question to ask, because it's a matter of what type of crowdsourcing and what sort of situations, where, with who, when, and many other different factors. And I think it's possible to develop a general framework that you can start to evaluate the security of these types of deployments in, that can then be specialized on a case-by-case basis. I think that there are a variety of things that are going to cut across and are going to come up every time. It's just a question of, to what extent is that really, really important to worry about that right now?
And that's why I was trying to take the hostile, I don't necessarily work in the hostile environments, and that's why I was trying to take the kind of risk management, so to speak, approach of private industry and look at the processes, the metrics, the application fostering, the training that the Red Cross could do potentially, things like that of, say, a natural disaster, and working with the agencies and the NGOs and bringing that aspect into it.
And one final sentence on it. I think the right attitude is to try to define a line, a score, a hostility level, a metric that you say this is very hostile, or whatever the State Department frankly would tell you the environment is, and then to just filter out the tools that that aren't competent at the higher levels.
We might talk about it as safety. I mean, rather than just presuming that it's hostile or not hostile, we might think safe or not safe or something.
Leisha's comment is quite accurate, that safety is probably the scale to call it when we're talking about hostility. In highly hostile environments, it's very unsafe. In all the other environments, it's relatively safe. Some, a little, a lot safe.
Okay. Over here.
There's a lot of talk of technology, but I think a lot of it is also people's awareness and thought process. People are implicitly very trusting. One of the strangest conversations I have every so often is I get a call, hi, I'm calling from American Express. Can you please give me your account number to prove who you are? Well, you just called me. You prove who you are. And they don't know how to cope with that conversation because they're so used to simply calling people up and saying, I'm from your bank. Please give me your information. And people do. So we're dealing. A lot of it is awareness to realize that just because someone calls you up and tells you and asks for something doesn't mean you necessarily have to share it. A lot of the volunteer groups live in a social media environment, and as you said, things get posted online. So that opens up risk for people post a picture of where they are or tweet, I'm heading back to the compound now. People can see what their route is going to be, and it's not only a hostile environment in a conflict. Take, for example, I spent a lot of time in Nigeria. In southern Nigeria, there's not a risk of hostility because of who you are. It's just what you have on you. There's theft. When I was in Haiti in late January, there was an improvised roadblock that was basically set up as an ambush that we had to circumvent. So there's a lot of risk out there, and there's a lot of information that people, especially working in an environment where everything is online and everything is shared, may not realize is risky information. And you talked about some of the Red Cross courses. I think Gisley, yeah, he's still here. Groups that volunteer or work with the UN and sign partnership agreements with the UN before they can deploy as an associate of the UN have to undergo certain security training, and a lot of that is online. So you talked about the Red Cross. Maybe
extend
yeah,
that
maybe
into the
look at
crowdsourcing.
some kind of security awareness as well.
Well, I mean, in the last 3 years, I've seen security awareness training programs in corporations and nonprofit organizations explode. So
You got it in the Boy Scouts now. You learn it as like
Yeah.
a tenderfoot.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh. So yeah, it's almost a no-brainer to add it to volunteer training internationally.
And just because we have a responsibility to make you guys more devious bastards when people point out tricks like that, the right answer is, I was just about to send a bunch of money, but I forgot what the address is, so if you can give that to me. But just a second, can you give me a callback number? This phone's about to die. I'm going to call you right back and give you my card number and send that check. And then the person gives you their number. And now the game is afoot.
Kat, can we talk? Yeah? You had a question?
Thank you. Kat Graham, Humanity Road. My question was partially answered earlier, but when it comes to the teaching this or learning this online, and it's constantly changing game, are there any groups out there right now working with public charities? We're incorporated. We're 501c3 public charity. Are there any groups out there working with them for and with the Red Cross, for example, for helping them learn the best process in social media to avoid those risks?
I don't know that there are specific programs.
Do me a small favor and repeat that question. I'm not sure the web is getting it off the mic.
Sorry, the question was, are there groups working with 501c3s and other nonprofit organizations to develop a sense of security in social media? And
specifically the Red Cross. Are they?
And the Red Cross. You'd have to ask the Red Cross what they're doing. I could never speak for them, but this right here is a sort of a semi-byproduct of Geeks Without Bounds. Hooking up with Eric and deciding that, some of the things that we know that like Sarah Jane Farmer and I teach people is how to make their new nonprofits more effective, how to get better programmers, how to get better talent, how to think about security and grow up. So some of us, that's why we're here is to be the people you're looking for. And hopefully you guys can leverage what we have.
And also say from, so I'm not aware of very many groups at all. I think there's one, I think InformSec, which is funded through USAID, and they actually run a small team of incident response experts who can be deployed to NGOs and organizations. They work around the world, but I think for the vast majority of the information online is more generally targeted to activist type groups. What I will say from the security community standpoint is working in this space is really fun for us, because the fact is that we're directly helping people who really need it, and in some of these cases we're going up against the worst of the worst bad guys, you know. And as a defense person, you know, like Riley was saying, it is game on. Like, this is great, we're going up against the worst people out there who are the best funded, who have the most capabilities, and it's us against them. Yeah, so there is a lot,
and we're protecting people like you. When we go to work for enterprise, we protect kind of jerks who are trying to steal money from people, and they are going to take our reports. They're going to take our reports and ignore them. So we don't really like the work that we do for the biggest paychecks. We really don't. I mean, we all take the money because, you know, insurers, I guess, don't really care much, but they keep paying us, so we keep taking it. But when we get to work with you all, we care. You're decent. You have goals that are humane and useful and moral and ethical, and the challenge is usually far more interesting.
Right. And so it's possible to make those relationships and maintain them. I think it's a lot easier to be able to attract people from our community. It's the work that Riley's doing, and I think it's why it's being successful.
There was a question over here. I'm double checking.
Eric had a question earlier. Is it still open?
Yeah, please.
And then we've got time.
Right behind you, Eric.
So I was wondering.
We're going to repeat the question because the mic is apparently not working. I'm sorry about that.
Hold it anyway.
Yes, 'cause it's a beautiful prompt. You will feel self-conscious.
You have the speaking stick. Go ahead.
So, Eric Spry, FCC. So I'm wondering if, in the context of crowdsourcing and social media, which a lot of us are engaging to different degrees ahead of our agency's sort of official ability to do these things. Is there kind of like a DMZ concept that we should apply to the things that we put out and collect in crowdsourcing? And keep it isolated. You know, I see a lot of people on their desktops. You know, they're using crowdsource applications. They're using social media. You know, on behalf of the agency. You know, and that seems like risky behavior. You know, especially as these things evolve quickly and maybe before you have a chance to go to the mechanic next time.
Yeah, if you have
Yeah.
Sorry. Eric Spry from FCC asked, while you all are working ahead of the developing policies, are there basic strategies and techniques you can use to sort of step forward, you know, have a lean forward attitude towards security? And yeah, there really is. And I know this one's going to sound kind of terrible because we all like our new MacBook Airs and iPhones. Carry 3 laptops. Have a laptop for work and a laptop for home and a laptop for when you leave the country. Just so it's really said at least once, if I leave the borders of the United States of America, I do not take a single digital device that I used the day before. I usually go to the store and buy a fresh, brand new box, put it in my bags, and open it when I get out of country. It will never have been turned on inside the U.S. Typically, I'll have them imported from another country. I'll order French iPhones, and then when I get to Paris on the flight to, say, India, I'll open the box and turn it on. Because even the serial number, even the MZ, even all these little numbers have in them a little bit of leak about where I'm coming from. I'm not like one of those cool people on TV, you know, spies or whatever, but I am pretty well known in a lot of countries. You know, Singapore and Japan, really, I do a lot of work there, and there are people who, for the hell of it, like to break my bank account. That's okay, because I only use Visa or backed, you know, FDIC-backed accounts and stuff. I have a safety net behind me in the American Treasury, but my laptop doesn't have any sort of similar guarantee. There's no federal agency that can come in and repair my data if it's been destroyed. So, which also, just so I guess you guys aren't probably the audience for it, but NSA really needs to take responsibility for all your laptops. You should tell them that. I'm sure.
You know, the next time you see
they'll
them.
care.
And specifically to your point, you're talking about isolation. Can you isolate the operations from what you're doing that's ahead of policy? And I think isolation is a fantastic idea, and it's one of the core principles for developing a good security practice is to isolate things. Exactly what Riley was saying. Have multiple laptops. Things are very well isolated, and I would also say I think there's a great opportunity for organizations who are forward-leaning, who are looking forward, and willing to push the envelope on this to really step up and take the lead. on the security work that needs to be done. You know, John was asking what can agencies do, and I think what really is absolutely needed is that, you know, it's one thing for us to sit down and come up with our little rules for crowdsourcing and come up with them and just turn them out onto the internet. But what I think is really desperately needed is for an organization that's large enough to count to work with people like us to come up with answers to the questions. There's been a lot of questions about trust. We understand trust. We spend a lot of time thinking about trust. We have ways to deal with it. There's been questions about, you know, vulnerabilities and keeping our software safe. We know how to do that. It's what we do. And I think that we can work with an organization and then put those together, do it, and then that organization, by nature of being the first one to solve that problem, will be way ahead of the pack and be able to lead this space going forward. And I think it's something that's desperately needed for this to move forward.
We're not going to quit quite yet. One more down here.
So, hi, Luis Bermudez from the Open Geospatial Consortium, and maybe you know how my question is going to go. So you have talked a lot about open software, right? But we have not talked too much about standards, which is the interface of the components. And we have talked, or there has been some questions related to, well, how do we get crowdsourced data tools communicate with government tools, services, and clients? So can you talk about what are the standards that are being used in crowdsource for security purposes?
Now that question changed at the end. But George, you want to try to start with that?
Well,
and then Riley and BK, I'll go to you on each one of those.
Speaking more generally about standards, and as a software developer and someone who's worked on these deployments trying to integrate between crowdsourcing and government organizations and back and forth, I think the people like the Open Geospatial Consortium who are developing standards for the interchange of information are doing fantastic work, and it's desperately needed. I think that we will never reach a point where everything is standardized. And so for the foreseeable future, as far as I can predict, non-standard is going to be the standard. And I think that more work needs to go into processes to fuse the information and to transform between standards and between formats than in trying to get everyone to agree to one format. And I'll turn over to these guys to talk about security and specifically.
Riley?
Well, actually, I don't want to talk about security either. I want to talk about what you talked about.
All right, let's do that then. We are the ones that had the microphones.
Yeah. Woohoo! I think that the right way to consider code and data as they apply to these circumstances is that the software, in my opinion, must be commercially backed, and that gives it a responsibility to do things like support data interchange, because people who will pay for the software will pay for it if it does what they need. That will drive them to people like you to understand the standards you're developing. Non-standard is not only for the foreseeable future going to be the standard, non-standard is always going to be the standard. That's my projection. So what you need is a plan for how to bring an integrator onto the crisis scene to take the data formats you have and connect it to the software you have. That's the only way. That the more work you do standardizing it, the less difficult that job will be and the faster that the data will get into the hands of the decision makers. For security, though, just for security, some of those pieces are SSL, which will never be secured, but it's pretty close, and PGP. I don't really think that anything is actually necessary except a VPN. If you've got a decent VPN and it works over your satellite or your radio links, if it doesn't, come talk to me. If you have those pieces, you're pretty close to as safe as you're going to get. The reality is you cannot get equipment that I can't break from 200 meters outside your camp. You just can't. We can do whatever we want. So look more toward the human factors for security, because that's something you can work on. And so security and data, I would only say SSL with client-side certificate mandate is probably the closest you're going to get to any kind of real trust in the field.
And to decrypt some of the acronyms, SSL is the secure socket layer. So that's the little comforting lock that you see when you're browsing the web on HTTPS. When he says client-side certificates, the process that's used to verify that you're really talking to Google when you make those connections is fundamentally flawed. So if you're inside someplace like Iran, or you're in a company, you're somewhere where somebody is using one of those technologies that can strip off encryption, they can get access to it. And by putting the verification on the client side, you can avoid that one very big glaring issue.
Yeah, so you know it's Google, and Google knows it's you.
Right.
Symmetry is missing from the common deployments of web security.
Right, and then PGP stands for pretty good privacy, which doesn't sound as comforting initially, but it's an established, fantastic system that's used primarily for email encryption and also for proving that the person that you're getting it from is who you think it is. And then VPN is virtual private networks, which are internet connections. So everything that's coming out of your computer gets wrapped in solid encryption that, if implemented properly, you can trust that it's not going to be snooped upon between you and where it's popping out inside of your organization.
Yeah. Sorry, BK. And there's one more product type that I forgot to mention, which is full disk encryption. Full disk encryption is a reasonably good way if your machines are going to be in your personal use, because if they ever reboot, you have to sit there and type a password to get the machine to come on. Full disk encryption for human-held computers is a really decent and solid way to escape later interrogations. You power it off and the device is no longer accessible until you give up a password. And many of them have a duress password that will cause the destruction of all the information on the disk. If you give up the banana and they type banana, then your disk dies and no amount of data will ever be recovered from it. It's a small loss if your life is on the line.
And then with what Riley said with regard to commercially backed software, or at least kind of what I said around having application fostering of by commercial organizations, having the software, the crowdsourced software, checked by maybe a third party through security. What's the word I'm looking for? Have it scanned, basically, to make sure that there are no vulnerabilities and things like that in the long term is also another way. Just to make sure there are no vulnerabilities for the information being stored in it.
Yeah, application security audits are fairly cheap now.
Yeah.
And PGP, by the way, the privacy technique that they're referencing, the software, that is free. It is available to anyone. Okay, yeah. I'd like. Oh, Andy. Yeah, we do. But it's Rob Monroe.
Dr. Rob Monroe.
Yeah, Dr. Rob Monroe. All right.
I can wait and talk to these guys privately about it.
Done. Okay. In that case, over to Lisha. Sorry, I was worried about you. I'm sorry.
For people versus corporations and uninteresting people, which most of us are. Most of us are not Riley. And when I travel, I don't think many people care very much about me in particular. So what is the? That would be my question. We can have at lunch, discuss at lunch. Is like, what is the realistic security risk for the kinds of situations that we're talking about, rather than the general lockdown, total hostile sort of environments that I think you're talking about.
I would say if you go to China with anything in your mind or especially in your computer or on your body that you would not want to have during a polygraph, then you're probably in a lot of trouble, no matter who you are. China has a very, very large population and the capacity to inspect each person that enters their country in ways you probably wouldn't believe if I said them out loud. So it really depends on where you're going. If it's not a major, large, very strong government, you're probably fine. You really are. There's really probably not much to worry about, and especially if your email isn't really something that you're going to die if you lose.
Just as a momentary anecdote related to that, I had dinner last night with a man, and the subject of China came up for some reasons that were completely unrelated to security or anything else. And he mentioned that he knows the Chinese major, that when he gets up from the table, walks to his car, gets in his car, drives home, and opens his door, which is not electronic in any fashion, that Chinese major, will know everything that he has done from the moment he left the table, even though he's tried to be quite careful about that. Does that sound feasible?
I have, personal security liability exposure is in my mind
leave
now.
it at that.
In China, your laptop, if you leave your laptop in your room for 15 minutes, it may come back 2 grams heavier. Your phone, if you leave it alone in a room for more than 3 or 4 minutes, probably has been cloned.
Well, it's a state-owned phone.
No, I mean my phone.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
My phone there, your phone there.
and
We'll
I-
be cloned in a few minutes.
And I would say, depending on it's entirely dependent on the environment. But what I believe is taking place is that all of the bad guys and bad organizations, be they insurgent groups, terrorist organizations, governments, organized crime, they're all smart people, and they all understand the opportunities that technology brings, the vulnerabilities that they have. And I think that every organization worth its salt is developing some form, some manner of attack capabilities, even if it's something as simple as realizing, hey, if we go online and search for Iraq Apache helicopter pictures, we can potentially pull out geotagged information. And so I think going forward, we've been very lucky to get as far as we have with the type of insecure technology that's being used and the type of social media and crowdsourcing things that have taken place. But I think that going into the future, we are going to have to be prepared for organizations that have caught on to the capabilities of these technologies, are aware of them as a threat, and are taking steps to exploit those vulnerabilities.
But to be fair, for traditional disaster services, domestic especially, and for some basic international, China and some of the other stuff, security for some of the other countries that are less friendly, you don't have to worry about security at this level. What Riley's talking about, what George is talking about, are some extremes. So we can talk about that more, I think, at lunch, and about the dichotomies. But there's definitely a risk management at differing levels and differing extremes.
I'd like to point people's attention. Dr. Rebecca Goolsby from Office of Naval Research wrote a really nice letter to the participants of this workshop on security of crowdsourced data, particularly in hostile environments. So if you look through your packets that you were given yesterday, I believe there's probably some copies out on the front too. I call your attention to that. Also, over lunch, if people would be so kind as to fill out the evaluation form, but most importantly, the priorities list. We have a session closing where we're going to have an open discussion about what those priorities should be for our attention in the coming year. So if people can give these filled out to us when they come back from lunch, that'll give us a little bit of time to tally them before we have that discussion. And lastly, I'd like to thank this absolutely fantastic panel and to Eric Rasmussen, who made it happen.